Arongwa na ina namo wana to ahona na ina yetso wana heya yo weyo heya yo we heya yo weyo heya yo we heya yo weyo heya yo we. All right, well, hello, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm sure Alex does as well. I am Tim Sider, as Tom brought up. I'm a PhD candidate over at SMU, and I focus on colonial Texas and specifically Native peoples in that region, and also these forts that the Spaniards created or built called presidios. My latest book is about those Spanish presidios. I'm also joined here by Alex Perez, who is a tribal member of the Karankawa, and as Tom mentioned, he traveled all the way from Arizona to be here. So thanks again, Alex. Alex is also revitalizing the Karankawa language, so he is a phenomenal person for you to ask questions to. So before we move on to the meat of this presentation, it's important for me to lay out a roadmap for our talk tonight. So first, I will spend about 40 or so minutes providing an overview of the Karankawa Indians. In other words, I'm going to provide you with a general history of the Karankawa peoples from their inception around the 1200s to the present day. Now, that's obviously a lot to cover, so much of it will be high level, a lot of it will be macro, but I will occasionally dive deep into specific Karankawa historical actors and important events. Alex will be covering the second half of this presentation, around 20 or so minutes, and he'll discuss how the Karankawas have revitalized their culture presently and have regathered as a people. He will also discuss his own perspectives growing up as someone who is Karankawa. So our goals for this presentation are threefold. The first is to demonstrate Karankawa persistence. And by that, I mean to show that the Karankawas are not an extinct people. The second main goal is to prove that the Karankawas were a very powerful entity on the Gulf Coast, that they greatly influenced what we know now as Texas. And the Karankawas essentially controlled the entire coastline from Galveston Bay down to Corpus Christi Bay, a long stretch of land for over 500 years, 570 to be exact. By comparison, the United States is only 244 years. So the Karankawas have controlled their sacred spaces longer than the United States has been a nation. The third main goal of this talk is to debunk Karankawa-related myths. So as Tom mentioned, if you grew up in Texas and went through our school system, you likely have heard all sorts of crazy things about indigenous peoples. In terms of the Karankawas, I'm sure you heard that they were 8 feet tall, that they ate babies, they were from the Caribbean, and so on and so on. So we'll dive into these myths throughout the talk. Throughout the talk, I'll kind of dive into each myth as they arise. All right, so let's actually dig into the meat of everything. So let's start with the basics. Who are the Karankawas for people that aren't familiar with this tribe? Who are the Karankawas? And the answer is they are a Texas Native American culture. Now, it's important for me to break that down, the Karankawa culture. Whenever I say Karankawas, I'm using that as an umbrella term for multiple different tribes. Now, these tribes, they spoke the same language, they shared a similar culture, but they may not have necessarily been allies or friendly to each other. They're not a united entity, at least for the majority of their history. So whenever I'm saying Karankawas, I'm referring to these people generally, as you would say Americans to people that live in this area. So the Karankawas lived, as I already said, between Corpus Christi Bay and Galveston Bay. And it's around 200 miles of coastland. And they ranged usually inland about 50 or so miles. But we also see them even further, 100 or 200 miles in Texas to trade with other Native American groups. But their sacred spaces, their homeland is that 200-mile stretch of coastland and 50 miles inland. So the Karankawas as a culture seem to have begun in the middle of the 1200s. So in the middle of the 1200s, we started to see all these people that share this similar culture, that speak the same language. And we know this, interestingly enough, because of the pottery we find in archaeological digs. So around the 1200s, we start to see what is called Rockport pottery being made all along the Texas Gulf Coast. And this pottery, this Rockport pottery, is different than any other pottery we find in Texas. And the main distinguishing factor is that these ceramics, they use asphaltium, or naturally occurring tar, as design elements, and that's a better way to hold in fluids and what have you. So when Europeans come, they see the Karankawa people using this type of pottery, and only the Karankawas are using really this type of pottery. So we have an idea that the Karankawas likely began their culture in 1250, because that's when we start seeing this pottery arise in archaeological digs. So this leads us to the very first myth of the night that is important to debunk about the Karankawas. And that myth is that they were actually Carib Indians who originated from the Caribbean, and in the 1400s they invaded Texas. They made their entire way along the coast, all the way across into the Gulf of Mexico, came all the way up to through Mexico, and landed on the Gulf Coast. So this is obviously very problematic and not the case. As we see from the pottery above, the Karankawas were here in the 1250s. We're pretty certain of that. And we're also very certain that their ancestors, these Karankawa-speaking people, were in Texas for far longer than the 1200s. And this myth has become extremely popular as of late because of the Karankawas' association with cannibalism, as is the association with cannibalism to the Caribs. Because these two people are seen as being savage, barbaric, and cannibals, a lot of people have combined them and say, oh, they must be somehow similar or related. And again, we just don't see that being the case. Now, this is problematic because it implies that the Karankawas invaded their own sacred spaces. Stating that the Karankawas are Caribs implies that the Karankawas are foreigners on their own land. And again, that's very much not the case. All right. So now let's move on to how the Karankawa people lived. So these people were a semi-nomadic people. In the winter months, they lived in large towns of upward of 500 individuals. And come spring and summer, these familial groups would break off into smaller little bands, and they would hunt for bison and deer on the mainland. So you would see this constant movement back and forth from the mainland to the islands. Now, I am very purposeful when I say semi-nomadic, because if we use just nomadic, if we use nomadic, it implies that the Karankawas didn't have settlements. The Karankawas did, though. They had towns, they had villages, they put down roots. Using the word nomadic kind of gives them this barbaric edge where they just walked until they wandered to and fro until something passed in front of them that they could eat. Instead, the Karankawas had roots. As I mentioned, they would move back and forth from the mainland to the coastal islands. And on these coastal islands, they had roots, they had towns, they had cities. And it is in one of these permanent settlements that the Karankawas first made contact with Europeans. So during the frigid winter of 1528, multiple groups of conquistadors shipwrecked along the Karankawas coast. The Spanish conquerors had tried to find wealth in what is today known as Florida, but instead dominant native nations forced them out of the region, and 200 plus Spaniards had to build these rafts made out of their dead horses' hair and local logs. And they built these rafts, they end up going the whole way down the Mississippi, were spit out into the Gulf Coast. And over the course of many different days, these 200 plus Spaniards were reduced to 80. And a small group of these 80s made landfall on what is today Galveston Island, on a small island near that called Follett's Island. So one of these small groups was washed ashore, and they were led by a man that I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And he, along with all of his men on that boat, crawled out of the cold water. They found a rocky spot. They ate the last of their corn, built a fire, and drank some standing rainwater from that little rocky spot. Now, the Karankawas encountered these starving and emaciated men, and the words of Cabeza de Vaca, "Upon seeing the disaster we suffered, our misery and misfortune, the Indians sat down with us and began to weep out of compassion." So the Karankawas offered these men shelter and food, and some of these conquistadors agree, and they are warmed and they are fed in these Karankawa villages, but others refuse, and they are afraid that they're going to be sacrificed by these Indians. These stories of the Aztecs sacrificing Spaniards have been rife throughout this area, and so these men are afraid. Some of these men are afraid to go with the Karankawas, and they stay on the beach. So scholars typically portray this powerful people, these Karankawas, as inherently aggressive to outsiders. And we see here that's not the case, and we will continue to see as much. Generally, when Europeans intruded on the Karankawas' lands, these native peoples welcomed them with open arms because they were seeking trading opportunities and means to strengthen their own clans. As one adopted member of the Karankawas said, "Nothing is easier than winning their friendship." But whenever Europeans tend to overstay their welcome or committed thefts or murdered coastal people, the Karankawas forced the outsiders from their land. So for Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, it was cannibalism that soured relations between the Karankawas and the Spanish. So a week later, a really bad spell of cold weather washes across the Galveston Island, and the Europeans that ended up going with the Karankawas are fine. They're warm and well fed, but those that did not go with the Karankawas end up, in the words of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, eating each other until but one remained, who, being left alone, had no one to eat him. So the Karankawas were horrified to see this form of cannibalism. They were horrified to see the Spaniards eat their own. And as Cabeza de Vaca wrote, the Karankawas were so startled at this, and there was such an uproar among them, that I truly believe if they had seen this at the beginning, they would have killed us all. And so this brings us into another popular misconception about the Karankawas, and that is their cannibalism. So some historians have taken this interaction to mean that the Karankawas did not practice anthropophagy or cannibalism. And the reality is the Karankawas did practice a very limited form of cannibalism. And this form of cannibalism was meant as an act of the highest level of disrespect. It is reserved for the worst possible enemies during tribal wars. Essentially, if you were a Karankawa warrior and you ate an enemy, you denied them access to the afterlife. This was not driven by a need for sustenance. The Karankawas had plenty of food. Their population at this point is actually growing. Their population number is at 8,000 people, we think, in the 1500s. But the reason why the Karankawas were so upset by this European cannibalism, the survival cannibalism, was they couldn't believe that these Christian conquistadors would commit such a heinous and horrible act on their own people. If we see it through the Karankawas' eyes, they saw these Europeans dooming each other from ever reaching an afterlife. These Europeans ate their loved ones, which was the highest level of disrespect. So moving back to the Karankawas' cannibalism, we actually don't see them practice anthropophagy starting after the 1700s. We don't have any firsthand eyewitness accounts. We do have an eyewitness account around the late 1600s, but nothing after the 1700s. But as we will see later in this talk, the enemies of the Karankawas are able to really latch on to this idea of Karankawas eating people and babies and exaggerate it and use it as a tool for their genocide. But let's go back to Cabeza de Vaca. I want to wrap up his storyline. So ultimately, some of these would-be conquerors were adopted by the Karankawas. Others were enslaved. Some others killed and murdered. And 4 made an incredible 2,500-mile overland trek to Mexico City, where they reported everything they encountered and saw. So all that happened again in 1528. And for the next 150 years, the Karankawas and Europeans don't have much direct interaction. You do get some pirates in the late 1500s that try to steal and enslave some Karankawas, but that doesn't work out. These people are too tall, these slavers say, and they were able to wrestle their way out of it. But other than that, there's not too many interactions, at least recorded interactions that historians like myself can kind of dig into. But while there isn't much direct interaction, the Karankawas at this time are still really feeling the Europeans' presence. They're receiving new types of trade goods, different types of metals, foods, animals. They're having different cultural ideas spread from the south, spread from Mexico. And so too is disease spreading. European microbes are wreaking havoc on native peoples across the continent. But generally what I'm trying to get at is that for 150 years along the Texas Gulf Coast, we don't really have a good idea of what was going on besides large macro scale things. And you can see kind of this blindness in European maps from that time period. I mean, as we can see here, this coastline they have is not at all accurate, and they're not sure how big Texas is. They're not sure who lives there, how long it would take to get across it. And so again, there's this big kind of black spot on these maps. But we do know that the Karankawas remained in power as a cultural group. We're not sure exactly what happened, but we know they remained in power. And that's good because they're about to have much more direct confrontation and contact with the Europeans. So in 1685, we have the second major interaction between the Karankawas and the Europeans, and this time it's with the French. In the year of 1685, the intrepid and intractable Sieur de La Salle establishes a military settlement called Fort St. Louis. It's named after their king, near what is today Port Lavaca. And this settlement has around 250 colonizers. Now, these French colonizers, grand scale, ultimately are looking to attack their imperial rivals, the Spaniards in northern Mexico. They intend to raid New Spain's profitable mines, and they're specifically wanting to go to this place called Zacatecas, which has tons and tons of silver. But again, as I mentioned before, they don't realize how big Texas is. And so they don't know that they're actually 500 miles away from their intended destination. But they're very isolated, and they are similarly distant from the nearest French settlement. I think they're around 500 miles away from the nearest French settlement as well. So they're very isolated, but they're not isolated in native networks. They're smack dab in the middle of the Karankawas territory. So when these French settlers get to this Texas Gulf Coast, they have very positive first interactions with the Karankawas. And again, this dispels this myth of the inherently aggressive coastal peoples. So when they first see each other for the very first time, they're not able to speak to each other, obviously, so they have to communicate in Indian sign language. And the Karankawas, they grab their hand, they rub it across their heart, and they do the same thing to the Frenchmen to indicate a sign of their friendship. But things soon after went quite badly. One of the French ships was trying to go into Matagorda Bay, and it ends up breaking apart. And all these French goods that are meant to build a colony just get dispersed out into the waves. Now, the Karankawas see some of this flotsam washing to shore, and they decide to take some for themselves. They take some blankets, and the French see these Karankawa people with Normandy blankets, and they're upset. And a group of very hot-headed Frenchmen, as one chronicler of this expedition labeled them, go to the Karankawas camps with their guns on display, and they just take everything in sight. They take their canoes, they take their blankets, their deer skin, and so on. And as a chronicler of this whole expedition writes, these Frenchmen had more passion than sense. The Indians returning to their camp and seeing that someone had taken their canoes, skins, and blankets believed that war had been declared and resolved to take revenge. So the Karankawas proved very adept at ambushing and killing Frenchmen. The French proved far less adept at ambushing and killing the Karankawas. In late 1685, so after around a year, La Salle resolved to make a sweeping attack on the coastal peoples. And his idea is that he was going to bring all of his men out. He was going to go to all the Karankawas villages and kill as many as he could to end hostilities, make them sue for peace. But unfortunately for him, this resulted in only the temporary capture of 2 women, a young child, and the greater infuriation of the Karankawa people. So for the next 2 years, the Karankawas slowly picked off members of the colony, as did disease and just malnutrition and so on. So of the 280 French colonists that first landed here, only 46 remained around 1688. So La Salle, around this time in 1688, had to depart the colony to go up to Illinois to acquire aid. And for nearly 2 years at Fort St. Louis, the colonizers waited. They waited for this aid, waited for Sieur de La Salle to come back to provide this aid. And anxiety broke out, as did a wave of smallpox. So La Salle never returned. His men actually murdered him as he traveled north for resupply. And around Christmas time in 1688, the Karankawas, who blamed the settlers for the outbreak of smallpox, raided Fort St. Louis and annihilated all the survivors of this expedition, save for 6 children who they abducted and adopted. So the French fort in the Karankawas country was destroyed and no more. But the Spaniards did not know that. They didn't realize the Karankawas had destroyed this fort. So now we're going to get into the Spanish period. To summarize or give a good description of the Spaniards, they are extremely paranoid at this time. They are very afraid of their imperial rivals, the English, the French, even the Russians and the Comanches. They're afraid of these imperial rivals coming in and stealing all of their profitable mining lands or wreaking havoc on their profitable area of New Spain. In short, they don't want these other nations threatening Mexico, which has really become a cash cow for the crown. And so as such, the Spaniards put together multiple expeditions, around 10 in total, to track down this French fort, St. Louis. And they call this French fort the French Thorn, and they can't seem to find where it's at. But eventually, in 1689, a year after all the colonists at this fort were annihilated, except for 6 children, the Spaniards are successful in tracking it down. The Spanish governor of Coahuila, named Alonso de Leon, puts together a force of more than 100 men, and with the help of local native groups, he's able to march to Fort St. Louis, which he finds totally destroyed. He finds a scene of horror. There are 3 decomposing bodies just laying about. Old clothing is strewn everywhere. The buildings are in horrible condition, about to fall down, and there are no Frenchmen, at least none in the vicinity. So upon finding Fort St. Louis in such a terrible condition, Alonso de Leon has completed his mission. There's no more Spaniards that would threaten northern Mexico. And so Alonso de Leon burns down what remains, burns it all down, and then he returns back to Coahuila. But as I've mentioned, the Spaniards are paranoid at this time. And so next year, he returns and begins to build his own fort on top of Fort St. Louis. And the idea now is to send soldiers up to Texas to live in this fort and make it so the French can never have a foothold in this region again. Importantly, there's also a mission built for the Karankawas in hopes that they could try to control and contain these people, in hopes that the priests could try to put Christianity in these people's minds and make them a more peaceable people. But the Spaniards severely, and this is the La Bahia, which is one of the forts they built. This is like its last iteration, as we'll go over. So the Spaniards severely underestimate the Karankawas' power. They think they can control these people, but they are mistaken. The Karankawas, they see this new mission and this new Spanish fort, and they don't seem to be that worried or concerned. They are a large and powerful people that control most of the Gulf Coast. Why should they be afraid of a little outpost of 100 or so men? In fact, they seem to be rather happy the Spaniards have built a little fort and mission here. And they're happy because these establishments become a source of free goods. Every time they go to a mission, they're given food, cloth, and so on. So they begin to regularly visit these institutions to acquire these gifts or goods. But the Spanish priests aren't very happy with their new neophytes. These coastal peoples have very little interest in this Catholic God. They sleep through Mass. They refuse to recite the creed. And whenever the priests ran out of presents, the Karankawas left and went back to their towns on the coast. So this behavior did not sit well with the Spanish priests or the captain of the fort. And there was one incident that caused all this tension between these groups to explode out into the open. And that incident involved a bit of dust, a speck of dust. So there is a Karankawa man, we don't know the name of this individual, and he's waiting in line at the fort to get his ration of beef, his ration of free beef. And he seems to have had on a cloak or a blanket, and he shook out that blanket, and a particle of dust landed in some of the corn that a soldier's wife was grinding. And so the wife sought retribution, and she told her husband to go after this Karankawa man, and he does so, and he ends up stabbing the Karankawa. Now, the Karankawas see this happening, and they begin to shoot arrows at that soldier, and then all hell breaks out. And the idea by the captain, instead of trying to resolve this horrible outbreak of violence, is instead to try to corral all the Karankawa people in the area into a small hut. And some people don't realize that violence had broke out. They're kind of confused. And so he gets around 30 or 40 people into a very small hut. And then he gets his soldiers to try to bring over a cannon. And he gets his soldiers to also try to gather some rope. And he intends to shoot the cannon at the little small hut and try to kill as many of these people as he can. And those that survive, he's going to drag them out and hang them by the neck. But things do not go as planned. He runs into the small hut because the cannon's taking too long to bring out. And he calls all of his soldiers to follow him in there. And he has his sword raised. But one of the Karankawas grabs a piece of scissors and stabs the captain in the chest. And the rest find an exit in the back of the hut and escape to safety, except for one old woman who wasn't able to make it in time, and she is killed, as is the captain, who died from his wounds the next day. So after this event, the Spaniards had to relocate the fort and the mission outside of the Karankawas territory. And eventually it ended up in Goliad, or this area that they call La Bahia. And this is where the fort presently stands and is preserved by the Catholic Church in that region. So this is the trend that we see. The Karankawas are open to outsiders. These outsiders sometimes take advantage or cause problems, and the Karankawas kick out these outsiders. Now, the Karankawas are also causing problems too. I can't just say that it was only the Europeans. But when the Europeans are kicked out, they label these coastal peoples as fierce savages. They're always the victims in their writings, because that's the only type of writing that we get are from these Europeans. So the La Bahia incident with the cannon happened in the 1720s. And for the next 50 years or so, the Spanish don't really mess with the Karankawas. They learn their lesson. But in 1770, that would change, and a decade-long war between the Karankawas and the Spaniards would start. But before I get into the Karankawa-Spanish War, it's important for me to give you a lay of the land of Texas and how the Spaniards were positioned in this area. So during this period of the 1700s, and really all the way up until the 1830s, Native Americans held firm control over Texas. In other words, Texas was dominated by its indigenous people. We have this notion that conquistadors came and they conquered, but in Texas, the roles are totally reversed. You actually have the Spaniards holed up in small little forts, paying tribute to all the different Native American groups in the area, be it the Comanches, the Apaches, the Tonkawas, Kokissa, and so on. So every month, a group of Comanches, or in our case, Karankawas, would come into a Spanish settlement, and they would demand all sorts of gifts, ranging from guns to tobacco to silk to cloth to saddles. And a lot of history textbooks label this as gift giving. But in my own personal opinion, I don't think that's very accurate. I see this more as Spaniards are paying tribute to live on this land. Now, if the Spaniards did not pay their tribute to these Indians, they're in for a world of hurt. They are attacked, all their horses are stolen, as are any valuables or clothes they have. That's always an interesting little tidbit I like to impart, is that clothing was extremely valuable during this time period. So whenever Indians would catch a civilian unaware, they would strip them naked and take all their clothes. And after they upset these peoples by not paying them tribute, a lot of times they would have to abandon their settlement or it would be destroyed. And in one instance, a group of Castilians, a group of Spaniards, they went out and they built this new city called Bucareli, named after the viceroy of Mexico, of New Spain. The Comanches, they came to acquire gifts and trade with these new townspeople, but a jumpy European accidentally shot at the approaching Comanches, and he seems to have killed one. So the Comanches flee. They flee, but a few days later they return, and they return in force, and they storm this new city. They steal all the nearby horses, and in a matter of a week or so, Bucareli is abandoned and destroyed. And one of the civilians kind of fleeing this town leaves his fireplace, still has like some smolder still, and his house goes up in flames and it catches the entire town on fire. So not to get into that town. And so this is what happens when you make an enemy of this dominant Native American groups in the region. And the same thing very much almost happened at San Antonio, almost happened at La Bahia. And it did happen at this mission known as San Saba. So in this mission, the Spaniards were trying to convert the Apache Indians, and a lot of Native American groups in the area were not on too good of terms with the Apaches, and they were very upset that the Spaniards were giving them all these goods to try to convert them. So over 1,000 different Native peoples representing many different tribes came to the San Saba mission and destroyed it and killed every missionary and person within it. So again, Native peoples are the dominant force in Texas for quite some time. Their biggest weakness, however, is that they are not a united people. And that really characterizes the Karankawas at this time. They are definitely powerful. They have more people than the Spaniards. They know the land better, and they actually have better weaponry than the Spanish, as hard as that is to believe. But because they're along the coast, a lot of boats tend to shipwreck on the shallow bays of Texas. And because so many ships shipwrecked, the Chronicles were able to harvest these ships and raid these ships and accumulated quite a collection of weaponry to rival the Spaniards. But the issue with the Kronk was that they're comprised of many small tribes that have their own loyalties and are autonomous. So the Spaniards think that they might be able to take these Karankawas to push them out of the area because they are so diverse and divided. So beginning in the 1760s, the Spaniards really kind of start to turn their eye toward the Karankawas lands. And the reason why is because they want a port on the Gulf Coast. And the idea is that if you get a port, it allows you to resupply Texas much easier. You don't have to go all the way down to Veracruz. It also allows you to protect these valuable shipping lanes from pirates, because Spain's just shipping all this gold and silver out of the region. They need to protect it from these pirates. And by having a port on the coast, it could also help the Spaniards stop the Karankawas from raiding all these shipwrecks that happen in that area. So as I mentioned already, the Spaniards believe they can rid the entire coast of these Karankawas because they're divided. And the Spaniards also see them as backwards and savage. And it's the Spanish we're talking about. They see themselves as being above any native person. They are an empire that literally spans the entire globe. How is one small nation going to defy them? And so the Spanish come up with this genocidal game plan. And the plan is to gather as many men and allied Indians, as possible. Probably rile up around 300 people, 300 warriors. And they're going to build some boats because they have no boats at all in this area. And all the Karankawas, all their towns are on these islands. There's no way of really getting to them because they don't know these secret passageways through the bays to the islands. So we're going to build out some boats. We're going to land all of our warriors on the Karankawas islands, and we're going to flush out all the coastal people into the open. And then we're going to slaughter all the men. They're going to slave all the women. And they're going to raise the children as Spaniards. And there are many historical documents that lay out this game plan step by step in that order. Feel free to go to Karankawas.com, look through the archive in the 1770s, and you'll find some. And this game plan really fits the criteria of a genocide perfectly. There's mass killings, there's land theft, there's cultural erasure, there's dehumanization. It has all the criteria. And so it's around this time that the Spaniards are creating this game plan for a genocide, that they're also creating propaganda around these people they intend to conquer. So one missionary named Gaspar de Solis, he's touring Texas around this time, and he visits Mission Rosario, which is meant for the Karankawa people. And in his journal, he writes the following, and this is reproduced in many different histories throughout Mexico. He writes, "All of these Indians are savage. They're indolent and lazy. They are so greedy and gluttonous that they devour meat that is raw and dripping in blood. They prefer to suffer hunger, nakedness, and the inclemencies of weather, provided they be left free to live indolent in the wilds or along the seashore, where they give themselves over to all kind of excesses, especially to lust, theft, and dancing." So Solis also said they were cannibals, but it's important to point out that Solis never actually went out to visit or meet with the Karankawas. Instead, he spent most of his visit eating with the captain in the captain's quarters, staying within the confines of the mission. So he was not really all that familiar with their culture or with these people. So Solis's writings would be copied over and over and over again, and it really kind of started this propaganda against the Karankawas. But let's get back to the Karankawa-Spanish War. The Karankawas are very intelligent. They know what's going on, and they see people trying to build boats in the woods, and they realize that war is about to be waged against them, and they're not too fond of being annihilated, so they decide to go to the war with Spaniards, and so begins the decade-long Karankawa-Spanish War. Let me just check how I'm doing on time. So right off the bat, the Karankawas are just making a fool of the Spaniards. They are stealing all their horses, they are harassing citizens, and they are killing soldiers. They know the Spaniards are building canoes along the wooded areas of the rivers, so they actually lie in wait for any type of civilian or carpenter to go out there and try to cut down some trees, and they ambush them and kill them. And another always great story to tell is that the Karankawas will be out on the bays in their boats, and Spanish expeditions going out there to try to kill them see them out on the bays in the boats, and they call them over to say, hey, come land so we can exact our punishment upon you. But they just leisurely paddle away, these Karankawa people. So it was really a disaster for the Europeans and the Spaniards. And to make matters worse for the Spanish, there's a prominent war chief among the Karankawas who rises to power. His name is Joseph Maria. Now, we don't know his Karankawa name. We just know his Christian name, which is Joseph Mary. But this shows us, and we already know, that Joseph Maria grew up in the missions, and he actually speaks Castilian Spanish perfectly. And eventually he had to flee the mission because he slaughtered a cow without permission, and the father imprisoned him, and he was able to escape prison and go to the coast. And whenever he goes to the coast, he assembles a group of around 10 warriors, and he just begins to attack the Spanish, and he becomes absolutely notorious among the Spaniards. His list of crimes, and these are direct quotes, include the following: abusing the confidence of the Spanish, kidnapping mission neophytes, dealing wanton death, enslaving the downtrodden, hunting down natives loyal to the Spaniards, and even killing his own mother with a thrust of a spear. Now, only half of those are true. But the important thing about Joseph Maria is that he, as a warrior chief, a head chief of the Karankawas, is able to unite these peoples into a more singular entity. And he's able to unite all these autonomous tribes into one to fend off the Spanish genocide. And so the Karankawas are thoroughly winning this war. I'll go back to Joseph Maria. So the crown realizes how important he is, and they try all these different types of means to capture and execute him. They try to put a bounty on his head. They convince other Indians to try to assassinate him. They even go as far to try to fake a shipwreck. They're going to load up all their men into a boat, try to crash it onto the coast. Whenever Joseph Maria and his warriors come to try to loot it, they're going to pop out, have him surrounded, and kill him. But nothing like that works for them, and the Karankawas continue to win the war. I do realize I'm going a little bit over time, so I'm going to speed up just a tad. So the Karankawas are winning the war, but then something changes everything, and that is a pandemic. A pandemic of smallpox sweeps up from Mexico, and it reaches the Gulf Coast, and any kind of war the Karankawas was winning kind of just ends, becomes a standstill as pandemic annihilates all these people. And so the Karankawas stop their attacks against the Spaniards. But the war is not yet over. The Spanish are still trying to kill them. Eventually, there's a new captain who comes into power named Martinez Pacheco. And instead of trying to attack the Karankawas to end the war, he decides to throw them a little bit of a party. So he actually invites Joseph Maria, this man that had murdered many different Spaniards. He invites them to San Antonio. And in San Antonio, he provides them with all sorts of different gifts, including silk suits, knives, alcohol, tobacco. And he sits down with Joseph Maria and other war chiefs of this group, and they kind of hash out a peace agreement. And the peace agreement essentially is a winning agreement for the Karankawas. What happens is the Karankawas and the Spaniards decide to build a new mission in their lands, and this mission is going to be more of a tribute dispensary, where the Karankawas can come and go as they please and get goods that they need. In exchange, the Karankawas promise not to attack the Spanish that often, and they occasionally will promise to show some Spaniards around their land, but nothing really more than that. And the Spaniards never do gain their port on the Texas Gulf Coast. They never control the Gulf Coast. So for the next 30 or so years, that dynamic, and this is the mission Refugio that they built, for the next 30 or 40 years, that dynamic remains unchanged, where the Spaniards and the Karankawas are no longer at war. They found some type of peace among each other, and it's this type of peace where they're obviously not on good relationships, but there's no outbreak of violence that often. So importantly for this next session, the Karankawas during the Karankawa-Spanish War under Joseph Maria were able to unite as a singular people. Because they won the war, essentially, they no longer needed to be united. And so they broke back into different tribes, other tribes. And because they're no longer united, this becomes a really big problem because they're about to face a threat that's way more severe and dangerous than these Spaniards. They're about to encounter land-hungry white settlers from the United States who commonly believe that all Indians are subhuman. So on July 26, 1821, Stephen F. Austin, he crosses the Sabine River and he starts to tour lands that were granted to him by the Mexican government. During Austin's trip to examine his land grant given to him by the Mexican government, he encountered or he heard about the Karankawas and wrote in his journal, and I quote, "The Karankawas may be called universal enemies to man. They kill all nations that come in their power, and they frequently feast on the bodies of their victims. There will be no way of subduing them but extermination." So here we see two big myths. This exaggerated version of Karankawa cannibalism and this inherent aggressiveness of the Karankawas. And as this talk has shown, that's really not the case, that they're not cannibalistic anymore at this point, and they're not inherently aggressive. But Austin has ulterior motives for exterminating these people. He wants to get rid of them, one, because he's afraid of them. He doesn't want Anglo-Americans living side by side with Indians. But two, his land grant is smack dab in the middle of Karankawa's territory, and he wants to rid these people from that land. So Stephen F. Austin and his first 300 or so settlers, they move into this area, and they have a tenuous relationship with the native peoples in this area. They're not really powerful for that first year or two. So that first year or two, there's not as much violence as we'll see later on. And you actually have Native American groups who are giving food and other goods to these new colonists because they're so dirt poor and things are just not going good for them. But by the 1830s, the middle of 1830s and late 1830s and early 1830s, the colonists begin to grow in power. And as the colonists grow in power, the native peoples are losing their power. These lifeways that the Karankawas had relied on are drastically changing. Bison are no longer as plentiful as they were. Disease is ever present, and Anglo and Euro-Americans are just flooding into this area. And so between the 1820s and 1830s, more than 30,000 Anglo and Euro-Americans settle in or near the Karankawas boundaries. And by comparison, the Karankawas only have a few hundred warriors, so they only likely had around 500 or 600 people at this time. The Europeans outnumbered them greatly. And so starting around 1824, and I'm skipping a lot of this just to save some time, starting around 1824, we have militia groups that are going out to exterminate these Indians. And what we see, and I've studied dozens of these attacks, is that somebody sees a smoke or a fire in distance, they spot some Karankawas, they go back to their town, and they round up a militia of around 30 or so people. They try to sneak up on these Karankawa campsites, and they kill everyone in the camp. And when they kill people in this camp, they cut off their scalps and they cut off pieces of flesh. And this creates a cycle of violence where the Karankawas are doing the same things to the settlers as the settlers are doing to themselves. So it's just a cycle of violence of just horrible desecration to bodies. And so just like the Spaniards, the Anglo-Americans create their own false narratives. And one of the most popular that comes from this time is this idea of the giant Karankawa, that they're 7 or 8 feet tall. And we see this giant Karankawa narrative in these types of books. But when you dig up bones archaeologically, we see that the Karankawas are likely only around 5'8", which was quite large during the European and Texas period, when the average height was for these Europeans, especially these Americans, was around 5'6" or less. So this propaganda was extremely prolific and it remains so today. And this is because a lot of the professional historians who started to write a history about the Karankawas rely on these types of books that are already biased. Now, I'm 28 years old. I think I'm relatively young. And even I learned growing up in 7th grade, my Texas history course, that these people were giants, baby eaters, and cannibals. They're ferocious and aggressive. And again, that's not the case, but it shows that these myths that were created during this Anglo-American period have survived and thrived for many different years, and they continue to thrive today. Going to my last one. So the Anglo-Americans committed genocide against these people, but many different Karankawa people were able to survive this genocide through many different means, and typically did so by hiding their Indianness, by integrating into other societies, by moving to northern Mexico, all these different means, by joining other groups. But they continue to survive. And around 1860s, you have historians and people in the region labeling them as totally extinct. And that's definitely not the case. We had these people survive, integrate with different cultures, hold on to those cultures, their culture and their language, and slowly pass it down to their descendants until today, where now we have Karankawa descendants who feel open to stepping out in the public and saying, I am a Karankawa, I'm descended from these Karankawa people. We don't have any full-blooded Karankawas. Everybody that is in the Karankawa Kala does recognize that they are not full-blooded, but they are recognizing their Karankawa-ness. Okay. I have a lot more to talk about this, but I'm sure we can cover this in the questions. I do want Alex to speak. So thank you for showing up and listening to me. I'm going to hand this over to Alex, and thanks for your patience. But yeah, I'm going to switch over. Thank you. That's the tall guy.
I heard someone earlier say, he's too short. Yeah, my dad's a short guy. I'm taller than he is. I might ask, excuse me just a moment here. So my name is Alex Perez. That's my birth name, Alexander Joseph Perez. I'm of Irish, Spanish, and American Indian descent. Both I have native ancestry on both sides of my family. I don't even know where to begin, really. I just scattered a bunch of notes on my pad beforehand. I'm accustomed to just kind of ad-libbing, and as a musician also, I read the room and that kind of thing to see where in that way, I guess I improvise on how I'm supposed to go about speaking. And so there's a couple, so I was just scattering a couple notes. But first of all, I want to say in our language, ha'ahe kahamkiami, naim na ta hopa, ta plachewawa, Nahia tsohwana kahia metet tal ahlin kahia na uspame. What I said to you was, hello, people of the world. My name is Strongwind. That's my ceremonial name. It's good to see you all. I'm standing here speaking the language of my relatives, is what I said. Literally, I have this kind of notation, so I'm like, so it's all scatterbrained, so bear with me. Where to begin? So, we're all familiar with the term cancel culture these days, right? Well, there was a time when cancel culture came to the Americas, when cancel culture came here to Texas, or in the Como Crudo language, they would call this land of Texas Somi. And in that, and we all know history. It's not, I'm not going to, sugarcoat anything about it. We all know what happened here. And it's not my intention to invoke guilt on anyone or expect anyone to have sympathy or whatever. We all live in a modern age. So, I came up here wearing the clothes that I normally wear. Okay, so so we're all living in a modern world. But to speak of things in a historical sense, cancel culture came here, and a lot of people don't realize that there were entire people with entire complete communities, distinct languages that are absolutely gone, and you'll never know their names again, ever. It's hard for me not to be passionate about the things that I care about. I mean, it's the reason why I do it, why I do the things that I do, why I've been a songwriter for many years. And it's only recently that I'm an author, but again, it's kind of one of these things. I'll be another stage in my life now that I'm finding that my path is leading into other domains, other directions. And forgive me if I go off into tangents, because I do that, okay? I have all these notes and I don't even know where to begin. But, by the way, the real cannibals were the Tonkawa. They were actually friends of ours. They were one of our allies. Same thing with the Atakapa. So the Atakapa, they were to the east end of Galveston Island and onward. When Cabeza de Vaca's accounts, he mentions the Han. Okay, Han is actually a word in Atakapa that means come. I don't know if anyone has had interactions with anyone that you don't speak their language, and they've come to your community or come to your neighborhood, and you don't speak a word, any shared language. Sometimes when the first word that they say, and in their inability to understand or articulate, and they'll tell you something. For example, when I was a kid, and I grew up on the west end of Galveston Island, and there was a Vietnamese family that moved in. This was about, late 70s, and there was a young boy that came up and he introduced himself, and he says, "Hello, I am new." He was telling me that he was new to the neighborhood, but we thought his name was New. Okay, this isn't an uncommon occurrence. So when, let's say, Cabeza de Vaca said in the Han, they were saying Han, Han, come, So anyway, this is just kind of one of those little tidbits that, for the past 10 years, as I've been researching our languages, and I say languages plurally, because in the Karankawa language, they're is very limited to the record. There's basically only 100 words or more, and so I've incorporated into from other tribal languages, from other languages of our region. So I've been studying over 10 different tribes from our region. And it's like putting Humpty Dumpty back together. And it's hard for me to explain to you through my research that I went through a whole lot of emotions in that pursuit of gaining or reclaiming our native ancestry. There's a lot of people here in Texas and the Americas in general that have lost all tribal identity. There's a lot more than you realize. When I did my ancestry, 'cause I'm the family historian, I'm the one that holds all the pictures, I'm the one that all the family comes to for everything, literally. And so, what was I saying, Tim? Yeah, so ancestry. When I did my ancestry, I'm not even going to plug them, but when I did that, all of my native ancestry was all in the Texas region, from San Antonio down to just dipping into northern Mexico, and it was all concentrated right there. So, which is probably a good segue to talk about DNA memory. I don't know if anyone subscribes to this belief, but when there's much more about that than any of us really even realize. When I was born, my first moment of consciousness, I was a very spiritually realized person, even as a little child. I understood adult concepts, and I had a lot of knowledge that I was born with, and I had a lot of questions that I would ask my mom that they were like, "What kind of a question is that? That's like an adult he asked that question." So that's how I was very self-aware. I was very introspective. I would contemplate my own thoughts and realize things at a real early age. My family, I take after both of my grandfathers. We kind of come from that warrior class. And then I also have incorporated that spiritual class as well. My great grandmother, who I draw upon my Karankawa blood from, my father's mother and her mother. See, things aren't so linear. Things aren't so simple to say. He's too short, because the thing is we're projecting through our own lens of what we expect to see in someone else. I'm sorry, I know I'm going into tangents, so bear with me. So, cancel culture came to our culture at one point in time, and if you can imagine, can you imagine a foreign occupation? Foreign now. I mean, it's all perspective, right? Because I have a different perspective on what foreign is. Let's say there was another culture that came in here and wiped out all of any memory of what America stands for. You can't even fathom it. You can't even think that's a possibility, but it is a possibility. Okay, maybe from our history, we didn't have buildings made of stone. Everything was biodegradable. Now, in the older days, we had a very rich diet, and then so the people of this whole region, of this whole landmass, of this whole Western Hemisphere, had great diets. But then when you're choked out of that environment and you become beggars, you become a different people. There's a certain amount of trauma that happens. Any one of us can, think about a family trauma, some kind of thing that nobody wants to talk about, sweeps it under the rug and that kind of thing. We can all relate to that. Well, this happened in our culture. I was in a college class once, and I overheard, it was at the beginning of the class, and I overheard one of the students. I was the oldest guy in the class, but so I'm just happened to hear is just before the bell rang or whatever, and the guy was talking. I heard this young man talk about mascots and why Indian people would be offended to this, and that whatever. And I can't help but hear it, and so I wound up teaching the class for 2 hours after that because the teacher asked me to continue whenever I started, when I interjected and brought that up. And the reason why I bring that up is that, okay, in that region, or in that classroom, I said, can anyone in this class, and there was about 40 people in that class, and I said, can anyone in this class tell me the names of the native people who lived here? Or first I asked them if they lived here, and they said, yes, yeah. This was in California, Riverside, California. And they said, yeah, we live here. And then I said, can anyone tell me the name of the people who lived here before you? The native people. Not a single person, okay? I said, can you imagine being completely forgotten? So, and as a byproduct of that, of being forgotten, throughout so many, I can't say all because I can't speak for all, but throughout a lot of Native America, there was a cultural depression. If you can imagine depression, you understand how depression is within your life and your single life. Can you imagine that as a whole people? And what kind of things would become of that culture when, I may as well not even written these notes, but when, there's in cultures such as ours, as it used to be historically, children were raised by everyone. So aunts, uncles, grandmothers, we were raised like that as a community. And, it's funny because today, people, we all long for community, right? We all long for the simpler times when our towns were smaller and we had a sense of community. Well, that's what part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing with the language and with the songs and reintroducing them back to my people, is that we lost that sense of community. And as Native people, and along with language, if you kill a person's language, you kill that culture, because the language is what ties you. It's hard to ask for the audience to understand this. I hope that you can perhaps see from this perspective that I've had people ask me, why would you spend so much time doing this? Well, and the answer is, it's a multifaceted answer, but one of the reasons why I do it is because, let's see if I can stay on track here. We look around at our society, you don't have to have a stretch of the imagination to think about what's wrong in our societies, right? In our society, in our collective society, right? There's so many things. Well, I've been involved in Native culture since I should say all my life, but really around the age of 18, 19, and 20 is when I really started walking the red road, okay? So I had a lot of a lot of, I'm going to really lose track, but it's multifaceted. So I learned a lot from the Lakota people, from a particular, primarily from people from Fort Berthold Reservation, which I had the tremendous fortune of knowing several extremely powerful medicine men. My grandmother actually was a medicine woman herself, and we have very strong prayers and that kind of thing. And my dad encompasses that practice as well, a very strong medicine that you may or may not subscribe to, understand. But so that process of when I'm a sun dancer. I've been sun dancing since the mid-'90s, and I don't, for the sake of time, I don't want to really go into all of that. But through that culture and through the songs and these old songs, 1,000-year-old songs, and I realized the sentence structure of a typical Native style of speaking, sentence structure. So with the language that I've been working on for this past 6.5, 7 years now, though I've been actively studying it for the past 10, I used that knowledge and applied it here to come back home to my own people. So the other reason why I do this work is it was the thing that really propelled me forward, because there was a lot of hesitancy in my case, not knowing. I was doing it for myself at first. I participated in a particular medicine ceremony involving hallucinogenic plants. And I don't know if, I'm sure there's a few people out here, I bet I can eyeball them, see who's had some experience with those. But, you know, we live in a three-dimensional reality, but there's much more than meets the eye. I mean, you know, there's so much more to this existence. And when I first went into to my first ayahuasca ceremony, when you go, if anyone has, well, I won't promote that, but I set my intention that my intention was to speak to my ancestors, to speak to my relatives. In my family, there's a lot of trauma. And a lot of this I understood 20-something years ago, because, again, I meditate quite a bit, and I'm very introspective, and it dawned on me that the reason why some of this trauma that existed in my family is from this ancestral stuff that's passed down, this DNA, this ancestral DNA, this memory. A lot of the men in my family suffer from what I termed an orphan syndrome. Though they knew their parents, there was this disconnect and this abandonment of your own children, that kind of thing. Can you imagine that trauma of not being wanted by your own parents? And so there was this kind of thing. And so a big part of my journey has been to serve others, and especially the people that I care about. And so when I set my intention, and I won't go a whole lot into detail because it's kind of it's frowned upon to talk about too much about ceremony, but I can share this, that I met with 5 ancestral beings. That's all I can say. And they set me to task. They told me that I had to do this work. and they showed me what I would encounter, that I would have people who there would be questioning me and this kind of thing or whatever, and I told them, I don't want that. I don't want that responsibility. It's too much. And they kept reiterating to me, you have to do it. There is no one else to do it. And so when you have those kind of interactions, and I could tell you more about things that happened instantaneously with my family, healings that happened within my family through that medicine. So, these things, I don't need the burden of proof is, it's not my burden. And so the reason why I work on the language and I'm reintroducing songs and stories to the people of my ancestry and my relatives. I mean, we're all relatives. We're all related. So even this work, I do it for you. Though that may be hard to understand. But what I understand is that sound, words have power. People who are more, who study that, I would imagine, understand what spells are, right? We know this kind of thing. Spells, we spell words, they're spells. But they're also powerful. When the words of my people haven't been spoken, they're forgotten about. There's trauma that's still left on the land. There is, I don't know if you know stories about if there was a particular road where people would always crash at. Well, that kind of trauma is left on the land. And oftentimes we don't know the origin of that. And when that trauma happens, it continues to attract the same kind of trauma. And so part of my purpose for reintroducing the language and speaking the language is one, to address the trauma. It's part of it. Another huge part of it is returning our remains and putting them back in the ground. There's so much trauma that when the graves were dug up and now they're sitting in some university in a box in a closet somewhere and not being respected, I see those remains, and so many others of us see those remains as our ancestors, as our grandmothers and our grandfathers. We really do feel that way. And of course, I can only speak for myself. I have to always kind of remind people of that because we like to generalize things. I mean, us as collective beings, we like to generalize things and put them in a box in order to make it better understanding for ourselves, and also to indoctrinate people into that belief, into those beliefs. So I guess that's a bit of the reason why I work on the language. And let me see, extinction. Let me see, wartime, cannibalism. So, has anyone fight in any of the foreign wars in the room? A show of hands. Okay. When in wartime, are there not atrocities committed that people wouldn't want to talk about? When you're passionate about surviving and that you see the enemy, and as it's not like you're thinking the best of your enemy. You want to take their power from them. You want to take their life. So just to add a bit of perspective about war and that kind of thing, I mean, Vietnam War, they're chopping off ears, wearing them as necklaces. These are Americans, remember? The civilized people, right? So these kind of things happen. But also, in that archaic belief system, it was another way of taking your enemy's power, that you absorbed part of their power and you became more powerful, you know. Indian people talk about power. It's about owning your own sense of self and knowing your worth. And I speak about this quite a bit, empowering. I mean, I work with a lot with women who have been traumatized. I have 2 daughters, and they've both been, had their experiences, and most women, I would imagine in this room, have their own experiences with trauma. And these are kind of things that, that I like to help promote. Self-empowerment. It's owning your power, trusting your intuition. These are big things. Huge. Men are more reluctant in general. Women are much more open-minded, with this, with their kind of fluid way of thinking and feeling, and men are more rigid and structured and boxing things in and putting those emotions away. And so I know this is maybe getting off topic, but I think it does, it all relates. So there's those kind of things that happen in war. But that's neither here nor there, but it's something to remember maybe when we go back to classrooms or whatnot, and we can bring this subject a little more into perspective. Things happen. Things happen in war that you don't, I don't know how many offspring of Alexander the Great there are in the Middle East, and all over that region. Same thing with Genghis Khan, right? So on my book here, well, first of all, there were no pictures that anyone knew of about the Karankawa. Okay? But like I said, I've always been a very spiritually realized person, and very connected, and have a personal. I've always said that I have a personal relationship with the Creator. And in the book, I talk about how my first moment of consciousness, I woke up from a nap, and I felt I was being viewed from all around me, and I took a bow to all 4 directions. That was my first moment of consciousness. So I've always been very connected to spirit in that way. The reason why I bring that up is because on this cover of the book, this picture right here, I was walking in a thrift store, and this book, it was a P.T. Barnum and Bailey Circus, P.T. Barnum. And this wasn't on the cover, by the way. So it's so many of these types of instances have happened in my life where the book stopped me, or someone directed me and said, "Look at that book." And I looked at the book, and I opened it up to the very middle of the book, and there was this picture. Okay, and I looked really close. The only native people that had blue tattoos on their cheekbones were us, or the Karankawa proper. All of these men here have those tattoos. And then I looked again, and there's 2 women right here. And I've known quite a few native people from different nations. These are Apache women. I went on to kind of read through the little caption, and it was in Texas. This was in Texas. The Apaches were our allies, our closest allies, as a matter of fact. And they were little guys. I think the tallest guy was around, Apache would have been 5'7", and that's my height at the time. Now I know Apaches who are 6'3". Different diet, different, also different genes, different, so So there's a lot to consider about this. There's not just a simple answer to a lot of this, but so anyway, with the picture, there was that picture that was shown to me. And then later on, I was online and I was looking up Galveston, old pictures of Galveston. And in 1860 or so, there was another picture that came up. And it was a photography studio at the time in Galveston on Tremont Street, which happened to be on the same street that my great-grandfather had his barber shop at one point. But the picture was of a Karankawa man and his wife. And his wife was obviously part Apache as well. You could tell there's a distinct difference. But so I know of two pictures, and I was the one who discovered them. I was the one who was directed to them. This is all part of my whole life journey. These kind of things happen to me every day. Synchronicities all day long, every day. I'm always paying attention. I'm always hearing things and seeing things that go unnoticed. And I look around, nobody else is noticing them. So that's how these pictures came about. I covered that, I guess. Cancel culture. And now I don't want to go over too much time here, but because I know we have questions. But let me see if I can just do a quick glance over here. Oh, so when it comes to terms of what a tribe is, we were autonomous little bands. Okay, they didn't know how to deal with us. They didn't have a council that they could go to the new foreign occupation could go to and say, talk to your people, because we were autonomous people. So that was one thing. If you look at most soldiers in the United States Army, most of those guys are big guys. That's the warrior class. We had a warrior class. When we intermarried with other groups, especially after our population, after disease or germ warfare was, we dealt with, a lot of people died. So out of survival, we mixed with other people. That happened with the Humano and a certain the Humano people and a certain percentage of the Lipan Apache. They became one tribe and they became known as someone else, right? So this happened. There's never this linear one-way street of anything. There's so many different variables, always. But Tom, you want to take over, or else I could read you a story.
What do you want to do?
Oh, I'll read you a story.
Okay.
So this is
that was going to be my first question, by the way. Is there a story that survives from the Karankawa culture? Like Cherokee have their stories, the Hopi have their stories. Is there a Karankawa story that has survived?
In our case, everything died out. So I can only tell you from my perspective. Other people may tell you other things, okay? But from what I understand is that when we disbanded and were systematically assimilated into society, into this dominant society, like even my grandmother, when I pressed her for more information, she's very hesitant to talk about it. In her generation, and her mother's generation, and her mother's generation, that was something you forgot about. When history told you that you were, basically, you didn't want to claim anything. People don't really understand that. There's a lot of that went on, and now there's a renaissance of people wanting to know more, right? In our case, no. All we had left was just our DNA. And so Now, this is just me telling you this. Someone else may have a different story. But what I actively do is I actively go into meditation. I ask for guidance to help me do this work. And these stories come from somewhere, but I don't know where they're from. But they're not from any other tribe or anything like that, because I'm very, very careful about that.
My next question, any surviving songs?
Everything died. And so, from what I understand, I think even Latin had died out for some time, right? And it wasn't Latin? Or there was, but they had, at least they had records of Latin. And so then they started re-speaking it again. So this is reintroducing part of it. Most of it is from my observations, like observations of nature, because that's one thing about Native America is that we learn from the natural world. You know, when people came here, they looked at the dances and they're like, "Oh, look at these heathens," you know, and they worship, you know, the animals and that kind of thing. It wasn't so much that, it was that we learned how to live by watching the animals. We learned what was edible from what the bear ate by looking at his poop, you know what I mean? And seeing what he ate and say, oh, that's edible, we can eat that, it's not poison. Didn't kill the bear. By the way, human flesh tastes like bear. That's what they say. I kid.
Read us a story.
All right. So, story or a song, one or the other. No, just kidding. Because I'm prepared for both.
Either one.
Okay.
Or both.
Okay, so. Yeah, song? All right.
Where's your guitar?
Oh, I also make gourd guitars. I make them out of gourds. I cut them in half and I make a 4-string guitar. There's a sample over there.
Can I get it for you?
Oh, no, I actually left the amplifier in because it's amplified. Otherwise, you can barely hear it unless it's amplified, and it does have a pickup. But anyway, yeah. Play that sometime later, or maybe not this time around. Maybe you'll invite me again sometime.
Well, we can mic you up real quickly.
Well, so I'm going to sing a gourd song here. This was given to me by a Serrano native from California, from one of the Cahuilla Indians out there. He's since passed. But so he's a master gourd maker. And so I'm going to use, this is what I use for my own personal route.
Try to stay close to the mic.
Okay. I think it's going to be plenty loud. Arongwa na yina namo wana. Oh, ahona na yina yetso wana. Hey yo yo, 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 kiame eta pokta yaunak neka acha. Tana ina wana hey yo yo, 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 arongwa na ina namo wana. Tu ahona na ina yetso wana hey yo yo, hey yo yo, hey yo yo, hey yo, kiame eta pokta yaunak neka acha. Tana ina wana hey yo yo, hey yo, hey yo. So those words, arangwa na yina namo wana. Of this place we remain here. Tu ahona na yina yetso wana. From ashes we stand here. Kiami eta pokta yaunak. Earth below, sky above. Neka acha, tan na yina wana. Spirits old with us here. So these are the type of songs that come to me, stories that come to me. A little preface to that. At about 2014, 2015, I woke up from a dream, and my legs felt like they were extremely kind of shaking. I could feel the vibrations. I was very sensitive to vibration, is what I'm trying to say. So it started then, and there were certain sensations that would happen. And I would also feel like someone was taking their palm and pushing down on my head. Well, at this period of time, these harmonies started coming to me. And so these words, and then eventually the words came. First, it's the harmonies come. And then the words would come on top of that. And this is how a lot of Native songs begin to write themselves, is through that connection of spirit, that these things manifest in that way, in a very mystical way. And so channeling, and I was already a songwriter, so I was accustomed to channeling this creative energy. And so I trusted it. I wasn't afraid of it. And what happens is, through that harmony, it invokes a certain feeling. And then the words will come on top of that feeling. And so that's how songs are written in that sense, and when it comes to ceremonial songs and whatnot, and social songs too.
That was fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim, you want to go up front? Okay, Dr. Tollett has a question.
It's okay.
Alex, you may have already answered my question, but I'm not sure. Having worked with the Hopis, what is your origin story? And were there ceremonies that go way back to when you started, if you will, that maybe died out? And were they at any particular time in the year, any purpose, whatever? But mostly, what is the origin story, if you know it?
Well, like I said, a lot of those things died out. But there's one universal, one thing that I've come to know, that there was a universal story in Texas, and that was that we came from out of the earth. And then, but if you, of course, there's all kinds of things to consider. How people explained everything in their natural world was through creative way of some things had definitely are universal. The Hopi talk about coming up out of the earth as well. That's right. And others talk about a lot of them, and some of the tribes from our region talked about the Pleiades. They say that it came from the stars. And so in our case, like I said to Tom, most of these things were exterminated. So, you didn't, so, for us, it was to hold on to the past wasn't healthy.
It's my understanding, and I don't know if I'm correct, but the Karankawa tribe, their language was pretty much different than the surrounding tribes. Is that correct? And
that was what was written, okay? Mm-hmm. But studying it for 10 years, there's a lot of similarities. In fact, it's probably going to be in another book, because there's so much stuff to consider. The Chitimacha, who were considered a completely separate tribe, okay? There are similarities in their language. The same thing on the other side of Corpus Christi would have been the Kotanami. Kotanami had a lot of the similar words. I mean, or at least rooted. There's a lot of root words that are shared all around there. When I was a kid, I don't know who told me this or how I knew this, but from what I understood was that it was commonplace for everyone in that region who traded with each other. It was commonplace to know 4 languages. It was common. So if you think about even what we speak in broken English, right? The English would tell us we speak broken English. We use words like deja vu and rodeo, and we incorporate that into our language. So, and we all understand that. And so we're all communicating and understand that. So there wasn't significant amount of time and effort put into preserving the languages at the time, especially in Texas. When it was taking place elsewhere, when linguists were recording and documenting as much as they could, because they knew that, the languages were going to die out. So, but unfortunately in Texas, it was, you want to speak on that, Tim?
Yeah, I could also speak to this as well. I mean, language, as Alex brought up, is ever changing. And a lot of the words we have of the Karankawa language come from the 1800s. And at that point, the Karankawas were no longer in power. They had to intermix with their groups, as Alex mentioned. And so we have all these different tribal groups intermixing, and their language becomes kind of joined into a different language and into different than Karankawan. And so we see that happening pretty frequently, where these Karankawa people are having to intermix with different groups, and therefore the language changes. And if we look at the Karankawa language, it's comprised of more than 100 plus words, but these words are all taken from different lists at different times. So the kind of culmination of all these lists and all these words are different periods and are different words. So it's really tricky.
Yeah, so that's what I was wondering. I'm sorry. If there's if people maybe have 1 in 8 heritage from the Karankawa tribe, limited number of people, small amount of their ancestral background, and you've probably had to do some patching and bridging for these 100 or 200 words that exist. So who do you have that you can speak to where they would understand the words and they can have verbal discourse with you?
Yeah, there's... Sure. Yeah, we actually have several people that are learning. And so we do periodically, every time that we correspond, we're at least sharing some words. And because there's a lot to know. I mean, if you can only imagine, spending your whole life speaking one language and then you being reintroduced to some language, that you feel you should be speaking or you should know, and this kind of thing. So it's, for me, it's my passion, so I don't mind sharing it, and I mean that's what it's for. It's to be shared with, and so yeah. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 people that we converse like that.
How many people claim ancestry to the tribe?
Well, that's an ongoing thing, because part of this effort is because there's a lot of us that I have people that reach out and to Tim as well that continue. That's part of the purpose of doing this, is to reach out to more and more people who share the same ancestry, who know it within their family, because they're, it's not like, have a megaphone broadcasting all to Texas, so it takes time for these kind of things. So people come if they've read the book and they say, hey, because I've had a lot of people come up and say that.
Is there any help with 23andMe, genome projects like that, with Ancestry.com, things like that help you figure out what your ancestry is, what tribe you come from?
Well, they can't narrow down to the tribe, but they can show you the region, from what I understand.
And so my dissertation right now, I'm actually focused on that subject. I find that very fascinating. What I'm doing right now, my research, I can get to discuss this because I ran out of time. I'm actually tracing particular families from the present back to the extinction point. I'm able to trace, so far I've been able to trace 3 different families with Karankawa heritage from the extinction point to the present. But it's tough because part of the extinction, the genocidal process, is eliminating records to call back and see who your ancestors are. We don't have a lot of these records as well because the Karankawas were never very happy about going into missions, and it's hard to discern which of these mission neophytes were actually Karankawas. So there's not a lot of avenues to determine your Karankawa heritage besides ancestry, oral histories, and in some very limited cases, only 3 that I've found so far, an actual concurrent link to the past.
Yeah, and also you have to consider that a lot of churches and whatnot burned to the ground with records as well. So that was another thing. So we kind of vet everyone that comes forward, because not everybody, of course, everybody wants to belong to a club of some sort, and so we kind of vet out those who are looking to join a club. So because it's a very personal thing in a time where anyone can claim anything, and I'm very adamant about sincerity from people, and and knowing the people that it's not like for me personally, I don't push anybody away, because I also believe in helping other people to live their best life and just to be a better human being. It's really what it's about. We're all I don't know your belief systems, but we're all spiritual beings having a human existence. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be human? So I think that's it's all part of the same framework, I think.
Questions, comments, protests? Right over here.
I was wondering if the drought in Texas has yielded any new archaeological sites or additions to existing sites in terms of archaeological evidence?
So I actually spent this summer going around the entire Gulf Coast of Texas, trying to find any uncovered bones, any artifacts. And I would say that constantly there are new artifacts, new remains that are being found. But a lot of this land that they're finding these bones and remains and artifacts are privately owned. And because they're privately owned, you have a lot of these owners storing it in their homes or in their attics. As in one case, there's some person who had some Karankawa remains in his attic, and I think it was a father passed away, and he found those Karankawa remains or native remains.
So the story goes. I mean, I don't know why anybody would be possessed to put human remains of anyone in their attic is beyond me. There's a lot of that kind of thing. I mean, this is part of human nature too. Grave robbers, and I mean, come on, it's, so there's a lot of things to navigate through when it comes to doing this work.
In terms of the drought, that's also definitely had an effect. And as we see erosion kind of take away more and more of the beach and push it further inland, a lot of the Karankawa settlements and towns are now underwater, totally submerged, and we can't relocate them. But yeah, in terms of if you were to walk down any type of river in Texas or creek in Texas and start digging along the side of it, you're very likely to find some native artifacts. People were that prolific in this area.
Yeah, and also, that's part of, from what I understand, part of our spirituality would have been to oftentimes bury the dead near a waterway, being part of the spirit's journey back. So that's why you would find so much of that along waterways.
Thank you.
While I'm walking down to make it local, about 10 years ago, we had a very serious drought in Collin County, and Lake Lavon went down. And under the Corps of the engineers' auspices, archaeologists went in there, and it was amazing what they found. And it had been underwater 50 years, 60 years.
Yeah, before we go to the next question, I'd like to say that the reason why that this area, this about remains is so important to me, and this again goes back to this DNA memory. I didn't know until just a couple years ago. My grandmother told me that her grandparents lived in the middle of a graveyard in Refugio, Texas. And they were caretakers of that graveyard. And, I thought, what would it take for someone to find a graveyard to be a safe haven? What kind of things would you have to face from a culture around you in order for that to be your safe place? Doug?
Mr. Perez, thank you. The question I really feel compelled to ask is, like, our textbook, as a teacher, our textbook is very limited. If you were a textbook writer with, for example, what your experience is, would there be what couple things would you like to see in that textbook that represent your tribe?
That's a really good question. You win. Best question of the night. Yeah, it kind of stumped me a little bit. I think it maybe definitely to erase the teaching that of extinction, and I think there's a much more open-ended way of teaching rather than say this is it, and that's not it, and that's not it, because this happens in every generation, and especially in any group of people who want to push forward a particular narrative. We see it today too, and it's a very scary thing if we're not careful. I think we have to be very proactive with how we have to be able to look into the past and see, wait a minute, no, that happened then. We got to be very careful about things, and what we teach our children, because all it takes is, 12 years to really change everything, or first grade, 12th grade. It's really, there's 12 years, I'm an avid researcher about a lot of different things, and numerology and geometry and all these things. I understand how these things interplay in larger societies, and there's power in them. Like there's power in words, there's power in sound, there's power in all of those things. So, but yeah, anyway, see how I go into tangents? Isn't that terrible?
Sure. I think that this myth of extinction is such an interesting, fascinating thing because it's relatively new, this idea that the Karankawas aren't extinct, that this is a recent occurrence. A gentleman named Enrique Gonzalez, I believe in 2008, came out to the public and said that he was of Karankawa descent, but he had academics who denied that. They see that you cannot be a Karankawa. All of our history books say that they are an extinct people. We have all these documents saying that they were run down and killed off. And it's only recently now we have, would you say the roster is more than 100 people in the Karankawa Cadla?
Yeah, just within my family alone.
So you have all these people now coming forward with their own stories of their own past. They've been passed on orally. And then through my research, I'm actually able to find concrete stories that link this together. But it just shows, in my opinion, the power of history, that because these history textbooks and because academics like myself said that people were extinct, they therefore become extinct.
The popular thing, was to say, oh no, he's okay. He's Mexican. He's at least as good as the dog. I'm not trying to invoke guilt because none of anyone here deserves it. But there was a time not too long ago where, even if you we've seen signs, right? Those old signs that said, no Mexicans or dogs allowed. Well, the Mexicans were synonymous with Native people because, the thing is, Mexican is just a state. Mexico is just a state. You do their ancestry, they're Native people. But from what tribe, what tribal affiliations? Nobody knows anymore because they're extinct, right? So it's that these are the things that we need when we're educating. These are the things we need to know. You know that it was safe to I mean, if you killed the Indian within, you were safe, right? Kill the Indian, save the man was the slogan. It was effective. It happened to us. And so grasping at anything left, what I have seen that's happened within our own tribe, within our own council and everything too, is that part of our, there were archaic belief systems, okay? And now everything changes. There is no tradition, no matter what anybody tells you. It was always about evolving. Native people were always, even though, we did have traditions, right? We had these things that worked for our culture. And so now what has evolved in with our group is that now the only thing that we have left are our remains. And so the belief system shifts to accommodate. Because in the past, we would have, it was a taboo to hold on to a vessel, okay, a pottery, okay. They would, and this is all throughout Americas, the tradition of shattering pottery at the end of the cycle, the year cycle, was one in part for replenishing and renewing, but it was also a more organic material. Also develops microbacteria and that kind of thing. So it was also a practical reason to abandon this pottery and that kind of thing. So even the pottery for us now is just the shards alone, pottery shards, and the remains are like all we have left. We don't have land. We don't even have an acre to bury our dead. Think about it. Think about that. We don't even have a single lot to put. So, and this is part of our plight, is because we want to bring remains and rebury our remains. It has to happen to address this trauma. There's so much trauma. You look around, you drive down to Houston, you see all this craziness going on. This is part of the reason why.
One of the questions I asked Mr. Sider this week was how some of the myth around cannibalism grew from the fact that cannibalism could be an excuse for enslavement. Can you tell about that story?
Sure. So the Spanish Empire, for really its entire existence in the New World, outlawed enslaving native peoples for most of its time there. And the idea was that they're the crown subjects. You don't want to enslave these subjects of the crown, but there are loopholes. One of these loopholes is just wars, where if you're fighting a war with native people, a just war, and that's ambiguous, you're allowed to enslave them. Another second large reason or okay to enslave somebody is cannibalism, where if the crown is waging a war against somebody and they practice cannibalism, that justifies the enslavement of these people. But what I find most interesting is that at the same exact time these Europeans are so afraid of cannibalism, they're practicing it themselves. That if you go to Enlightenment Europe and you go to a apothecary, you're going to find ground up human skulls, all different types of the human body. And the idea is if you ingest that part of the body, it would heal the body. So if you have migraines, for instance, and you ingested some of the human skull, those migraines would hopefully go away. So Europeans are practicing cannibalism on a regular basis all throughout the Enlightenment period. But they use this as a tool to try and justify enslaving people. And we see this happening all throughout the history, especially with the Karankawa people, that, they did practice a very extremely limited and ritualistic cannibalism. You have Anglo-American settlers coming in and finding that to be an excuse to attack these Karankawa people.
And the thing is you have to see it as human nature. Every time that we're at war with someone, we have to demonize them. Japanese, the Vietnamese, the Koreans, or whoever, or any war of your choosing, there has to, there's a demonizing in order to get the population behind the cause and throw money at the cause. We have to demonize them and have and influence their belief. That's the whole thing.
I always tell people, if we were to wake up in the morning and find out that North Korea had warships with weapons on it at the Houston Ship Channel, we would be destroying it. So, or something, getting it to surrender or something. It would not be it probably would not be necessarily a peaceful resolution. So, if you look at it 200 years ago, people are coming into your land. It's a role reversal. Comment on that?
Well, one, about land ownership, first of all, is that Native belief has always been that nobody owns the land in the first place. That's the whole, one of the arguments that, today, I don't own any land. I don't own anything. I don't have, I grew up poor, so I didn't grow up with money or know how to work with money or anything like that. So I never, and it's been a long process. But as far as, can you clarify that question for me, please?
Well, when the mythos grew, how brutal the Native peoples were, I look at it as, yeah, they were brutal. They were trying to protect their
Thank you. Yes,
land.
Exactly. That's such a major point to be made, is that, I don't know anybody who would just allow for a stranger to walk through your door and start taking your belongings. I know I wouldn't.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We find as historians a lot of the documents we're having to rely on traditionally are written documents. And all these written documents we have are from the Europeans' perspective or the Anglo-Americans' perspective. And it's only recently that we're instilling something called reading against the grain, or using oral histories, or using alternative primary sources. And that gives us a different kind of perspective of what actually happened. But if you do only read the European or the Anglo-American sources when it comes to this topic, you get a very exaggerated view of these people thinking that they are 8 feet tall, savage, barbaric cannibalisms, when most things in reality is a gray space, right? Like, the Chronicle were not the most, they were welcoming, they were open, but they waged wars, they were human people. And I think if we only have one side of this story, it's easy just to say they're evil.
Yeah, and the thing is you have to, again, that's a way to influence the people to rally behind your cause of extinction, of extermination. Is, one, I tend to kind of group things into psychology, group psychology is, so same like with a narcissist, okay? They'll gaslight and get you to do things, right? And then you blow up and you go, and then they sit there. I have experience with one, okay? So I can tell this from 9 years of experience that, the term is gaslighting, and they get you to kind of react, and then they sit back and they go, see? And so the same thing when it comes to, it's a whole other extreme, I get it. But the stakes are higher when someone is invading your home, and so you're going to fight to the death. And I don't know if anybody has experience with knowing Native people in the military, but they're some pretty fierce people, because coming from that warrior class myself, I'm a pretty passionate person. I don't, I used to, I grew up fighting and that kind of thing too. And I'm a good fighter. I don't like to though. But, so when it comes to passion and protecting your home, you're damn right.
My father in World War II, he saw there were some Native Americans in his unit, and he saw how that they were fierce. And he asks them about their passion, since it had only been 50 years or 75 years since they were conquered. And what they told him was, we fight for our land, we fight for our women, and we fight for our children and our families.
Right. Everything is a ceremony. Everything is ceremony with us. It's all, even at social events, social events like powwows and whatnot. And I don't know if Texas really has much of in way of powwow, but at least,
not enough.
Not enough. And hopefully we're going to change a lot of that. But even that in social settings, and it's just a social dance. And, I knew a little girl, she was probably, I think she was 10 years old. And she, there was this little old lady, and she was a little jingle dress from Pine Ridge, and jingle dress dancer. And she went up to a little old lady and she says, "I'm dancing for you," so, and this kind of thing. And it's all about, your spirit, your intention, your heart, what's in your heart, and it's, there's a lot of dysfunction everywhere, and I have to argue that there's probably no worse trauma than in Native communities. I've been to quite a few of them, and the problems are compounded through the generations. There was a time that the women of the Apache women said, before alcohol, they never beat us. The men never beat us. And so, and then we get into another overlayment of that, and you get the churches that came in, and there's all kinds of horrible stories there that you can only imagine that kind of came out with Catholic priests and whatnot. And I don't really want to go any further than that, but and so there's a lot of that, and then go on to another generation, and there's a lot of incestuous kind of things that happen, and so the traumas get compounded over and over and over again, and then they get swept under the rug, so nobody ever addresses it. So then it continues.
I cannot tell you the shock I had a month ago, finding that this man is doing this research on a subject, and Alex Perez existed as a Karankawa tribal member, and I thought, this article is either didn't do their homework or everything I've learned is wrong. One last question from anybody? I want to make sure anybody else has a question. Hold on. She hadn't asked a question yet. We'll get back to him in a minute.
Okay, I'm very quiet anyways. I have two questions. One, was there any list for the Indians in Texas, like the Dawes list, where they went around and checked and put everybody on some sort of roll so that they could receive some sort of aid or something? And second of all, were there any places in Texas where the federal government or the state government established reservations? Yes.
I can speak to that, and then Alex, feel free to jump in. In short, no. By that point, the Karankawas were considered to be extinct, and at that point, they had assimilated into different cultures. And so we do have Karankawa people living on reservations, but under different names, like the Tonkawas or the Apaches. We don't, as far as I know, we don't have any actual lists of any Karankawa individuals. What we do have are ethnographers like Albert Gachette, who comes and he's interviewing people who knew the Karankawas, and he's writing down some lists of names of people that knew these people. But we don't have any actual lists. We do have mission records that have lists of Karankawa neophytes. We have some of their children, but then that kind of goes blank after a while, after they are kind of run out of the area.
Yeah, and also I had an uncle up in North Dakota on the Fort Berthold Reservation up there, and he was a very respected person of the tribe. And he told me that there were 2 families that came from up out of Texas, too, from the coast, that came up and they were absorbed into the tribe there. And you have to understand, most American people don't understand a whole lot about Native American society and cultures and reservations and tribal blood quantum and all this kind of stuff. There's the dog breeds, horse breeds, and American Indians that their bloodline is actually quantified. Is that the word? So they keep track of that, and there's a reason why.
Tim, you want to tell her the 3 reservations in Texas?
Alabama Coshada. There's the Kickapoo down, and what's the other ones over?
Tigua.
Pardon? Yeah, in
El Paso.
El Paso, thank you.
The Kickapoo and the Tigua,
Right, and
their
now-
reservations are about the size of postage stamps.
Right, and
Go ahead.
yeah, there's so much to be said. We could have a 4-hour discussion on just Native America, in general, to really, and it's really needed. That's a class. That's a class.
And the sad part is, in today's 7th grade Texas history, they still teach the paragraph. There's only about a paragraph about the Alabama Coshadas in the textbooks.
I believe it. I'm surprised to mention them.
Okay, my question is, why do we refer to them as tribes rather than nations?
They're interchangeable. It's just another term. Some people, I still use the word Indian, and then you talk to, other members and they go, oh, that's disrespectful. I'm like, come on,
Can you repeat her question for the virtual audience?
Sure. She asked why we refer to these people as tribes, correct? And
rather than nations.
Alex really hit on it. It's more of how the Karankawas want to be called. So whenever I do speak with some Karankawa Kala members, it's always good to ask them, like, are you okay with being called Indian? And Alex, you have no preference. Some people want to be called peoples. They see Indian as disrespectful. So it really is preference. It does get tricky in academia, especially when you bring up Confederacy, because it does have a strong definition. But we do use tribe interchangeably, especially with nation. Yeah. And I think it's important, just how I mentioned Karankawas having towns and settlements. We don't really like to use campsites or anything like that because it has kind of like negative connotation. And so there's a historian named Juliana Barr who's really pushed for this idea of labeling these native towns as they are. They're towns and cities. They're not little huts.
And these are terms that the next generation is going to have a different term.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I always think of those things in terms of generational kind of applications or.
Great question, though.
So thinking of the standard history, the Anglo history, in Galveston with John Lafitte and the battle with the Karankawas, and then in the decade that followed, Austin's colony and the conflict there, and then the supposed move to the exodus to Mexico, and then the presumed extinction. And then the most striking thing for me that I heard tonight was when you said, I think you had 2 ancestors, living ancestors, when you were a boy who were in Galveston, going back to John Lafitte thought, that was striking. Did they know in your boyhood that they were direct descendants of that tribe?
That's hard to say, but I knew, my great-grandmother, Lupita, because, you understand, to put things into perspective also, our family was Catholic. So we were the ones that actually, there was no way out. That was okay, so it was okay to be Catholic. So we were, but so when it if I remember correctly, that there were families that's the other thing too, is that there were warriors that were chased out for the most part, but no one ever asks, did they bring their wives and their kids?
Such a good point. Yeah.
Because we're products of that. You know, we're you know, they may have been chasing some of the men, but some of the women stayed behind. And, you know, with the children, and some of them went to, like in our case, my grandmother's great-grandparents were in Brownsville, Matamoros area. So that was the area where there were only a few of us from the coast that were down there. And so from what I understand is that we were part of that group. Did that address the question?
I think it's like such a great point, because I've been finding my own research is that a lot of these families that we're able to trace back to the extinction point live on through women. Men are much harder to assimilate into these cultures, and it's hard for them to find another wife that is outside of their own tribe, out of their own class, and that's hard enough as it. But women are taken advantage of, women are raped. Padre Island, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with that. The man that had that land, Padre Bailly, he took in a Karankawa woman as one of his servants, and he raped her, and the descendants are still here today. So we see like the Karankawa people continue through the women mostly.
And you know, the thing is in native, most native belief systems, this way of viewing things, like, you know, what's your percentage and this kind of thing, this is a very Eurocentric way of viewing things, because Native people don't see that. We never, you know, it's not a very commonplace thing. I know that there was even a tribe in Florida, someplace, I can't remember the story, I remember the story, but not the exact people. They had actually went down to Mexico to get to get Native wives to enrich their blood.
Seminoles?
Probably. I knew it was. Well, I mean, that's one of the tribes in Florida. This is why I can't be for certain. But there was that story where they actually, a group of men went down there and, you know, and traded for whatever, you know, it traded with whatever to get brides in order to increase their nativeness.
It's another like great point, Alex. What we're seeing is that blood quantum really didn't matter for the Karankawa people of this colonial era. And we actually have, I mentioned Fort St. Louis, that French fort that was established. And there were those 6 children that were abducted and adopted. And by the end of a year or two, they were fully adopted and considered to be full part of the tribe. And they did that. They showed that by being fully tattooed. They fully tattooed these children from head to toe. And they were fully part of the tribe. And they actually came back when they were grown adults and were able to walk through Karankawa lands unmolested because they had these tattoos. And you mentioned John Lafitte, the native peoples that waged that battle of 3 trees were actually intermixed of Karankawa and likely Okakissa people. And so the Karankawas, it was beyond blood quantum. They were always intermixing with different tribes. The Coco tribe was a unique group of the Karankawas, and they actually made their living by intermixing with the Bidets and the different Mayais and Okokissa. They intermixed with all these different groups. They spoke, like Alex mentioned, 4 different languages, and they were this cosmopolitan tribe that would go to one nation and to another nation and trade. So,
and you know, the thing is when, you know, it was very well known in Native society that incorporating or absorbing people from outside your tribe actually made the people healthier. So we understood that, and because there was, let's say, for example, even Navajos, they would say, you know, you can't even marry a 5th removed cousin. That's how, you know. So they were very well aware of that kind of thing.
My grandfather was well aware too. He used to say, "Now you need to take a Hereford bull and an Angus cow, and because then you'll have a healthier calf. I mean, he would tell me like I was going to go into that, like that trade, but he would tell me how to mix the stocks to make it healthier.
Right, and that comes from experience, right? I mean, so in every culture, except for maybe the British monarch, subscribe to that. Yeah.
I'm going to ask the last question, last two questions. Just a second. It looked like at the beginning of the presentation, which I was very impressed with this knowledge, it looked like for a while there, the first 50 years, there was a window of opportunity for coexistence. Can you comment on that? And I'll come up here.
Absolutely. So coexistence was a real possibility, and it was the reality beginning after the Karankawa-Spanish War. After the Karankawas pretty much won that war and made a peace treaty with the Spaniards, they coexisted with the Spaniards. And prior to the Anglo-American people, colonizers coming in, Texas was one of the most diverse places in America. You had all these different types of people, runaway enslaved, formerly enslaved people. You have, the Hispanic people are comprised of many different cultures, Karankawas, natives, some white, some French, some Spaniards, and even a Russian and some Germans. And so it's a very diverse place. But what happens very rapidly whenever you have these Anglo-Americans come in, they come in mass, thousands every single year, and they just overwhelm the area, and they settle much differently than the Hispanic people would. The Hispanic people were really into pueblos and having your own city, but the Anglo people and Euro-Americans as well would settle plots of land all over the place. So it's much harder to kind of control people that are settling everywhere versus a small city that has everybody in that same spot.
Okay, I wanted to ask about the coastal area is very hurricane prone, and I wanted to ask how did the people cope?
Good question.
Magic. No, knowing your environment, for one. I mean, like I said before, that, looking to nature, you always see, you learn how to live. And when the animals will tell you, people who, tribes that live on reservations near rivers and whatnot, there's a man that told me once, he says, when there's going to be a drought because the birds will make their nests low to the ground, and then there's a drought. There's going to be heavy rainfall because they start to build their nests higher elevation.
I just know from farm life, animals will move up.
That's right.
To higher land.
Yep, that's right. Yep, and you follow them. Wherever they're going, you follow them because they know.
I mean, Alex is absolutely right. I mean, the Karankawa people and their ancestors have lived on that land for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so they understood the type of environment that they lived in. They really exploited that environmental niche. And I think it's also sometimes deceptive to see images like these and think that they did not have cold weather clothing. They were hunting bison very, very efficiently. And there are historical documents that show they had bison for robes. And so they were they're very prepared for bad weather. In terms of actual historical documents discussing hurricanes in the Karankawas, I would love to find something like that. All we find instead are very cold spells. The area I study, colonial Texas, it sometimes is part of the Little Ice Age. And so at that point, weather was much different than it is today. You actually have the Rio Grande freezing over, and there's some accounts of people walking over the ice of the Rio Grande. So you have a lot of cold spells, but unfortunately no hurricanes, or fortunately no hurricanes for me to rely on.
Yeah, there was really no mention of it. I mean, everything happens in cycles, climate and whatnot. So,
Alex Perez, Tim Sider, thank you.
Y'all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.